Dodie, so if I asked you, war, what is it good for? What comes to mind?
Only that song, and I would try to sing back to you, absolutely nothing, which is, I think, how Edwin Starr's song from the 70s goes.
Yeah, but this is not karaoke.
Okay, not this time.
It's a different episode. Actually, I want to dig into this popular trope that we hear that war drives innovation in medicine.
Not just innovation in medicine, innovation everywhere.
Exactly. But is it really true that in the harsh reality of war, humans, being bad at being humans, create conditions that bring about life-saving medical discoveries?
Okay, that's a deep question. So I guess allegedly war-derived medical innovations is what matters on today's episode of Discovery Matters.
I spoke with Dr Elise Smith, historian of medicine at the University of Warwick and a specialist in British imperial medicine in the 19th and 20th centuries. She's an expert in many of the wrongs in the history of medicine.
I came through as a global historian. I was very interested in studying the scientific foundations of race and how racial ideology was used to justify colonial rule. And a big part of that was all about measuring skulls, right? Measuring people's heads to try to determine their state of intelligence or state of evolutionary development.
Oh, my.
Yes, there it is. As we know, there's as much history that shames us as there is history that makes us hopeful.
True.
But from this horrible hypothesis, a perceived need to measure the physiques of sailors started to change things.
Army and naval doctors who start creating growth charts in the 19th century. The Navy is obviously recruiting young boys, and they're trying to figure out how tall they're going to grow and if they're going to meet the standards for enlistment in the Navy by the time they reach the age of 15. And so from that kind of research, I moved over into working on health in the Navy in the 19th century.
Well, medicine in the military is just by definition different from medicine for the general population, isn't it?
Yes, of course, and not always in the obvious ways. I mean, military medicine is better funded, yes, and there's occasionally a lot more urgency to it. The idea, of course, is to get your patient fighting again, right? So the question is, how did military medicine evolve differently from civilian medicine?
Military medicine is interesting because it's actually the first form of state medicine, right? So we sort of think about state medicine or public medicine as really coming out of, the NHS, the post-World War II period. But actually, a kind of medical provision that is funded by the government actually goes back centuries, right? That military medicine is really the foundation of state medicine. It's not a kind of medicine that's generally applicable. So specifically for a long time, of course, concerned with battlefield wounds and injuries. Civilians aren't normally faced with being stood next to exploding bombs or being shot at.
Okay, I get it. It's a specific set of conditions and injuries that military medicine is dealing with.
Yes, and it's not just the horrors that humans inflict on each other. Military medicine is really interested in infectious diseases as well. You only have to think about the colonial expansion by European powers, where one of the great obstacles in tropical latitudes were diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. They were like a major factor in determining the Caribbean, for example, being established as the major sugar plantation of the world, rather than West Africa, which is actually much closer and easier to get to from Europe.
Wow.
So you have military and naval physicians really trying to get a handle on those kinds of diseases. And so a lot of research is actually done kind of at the forefront of these military campaigns. Another thing about military medicine is it's a very limited demographic. So it tends to be healthy men. So this is not a medicine that deals with children, with women, with older people.
So a focus on military circumstances slows down medicine for women, the elderly, and children.
Perhaps, yes, it certainly diverts investment, but the goal of the military was not really the preservation of life into old age. It's triage. Who's going to die? Who can we save? Who can we patch up and send back out there? In fact, they invented triage. So it's brutal, and it has quite a different dynamic between doctor and patient.
Than civilian medicine, and I guess so, because it seems incredibly logical. There's an equation there, seems mathematical. But I'm curious about the relationship between the patient and doctor in the military. What's the human part of it? And how is that different from what it's like for us to go into the doctor's office or the hospital? Is there a catch?
I think when we go to the hospital, we generally think that the doctors are on our side. And that tends not to be the relationship that especially men in the ranks have with doctors in a military context. So doctors are charged, for example, with detecting malingering, which means that they're constantly suspicious of their patients. Are they genuinely sick, or are they kind of milking things? There's this real sense that doctors are trying to get them patched up as quickly as possible so that there's not a real care for holistic health, as it were, right? It's just about getting people back on their feet so that they can go back to the front lines.
Thinking about the medical innovations, this doctor-patient dynamic really affects the way in which innovation comes about.
War obviously creates a lot of pressure. A really good example of this during the First World War is with shell shock, what we now sort of think of as PTSD. We have lots and lots of people having mental breakdowns. And this really allows the very young field of psychology and psychiatry to have a huge kind of boost. When you think about orthopedics, you've got lots of people losing their limbs all at the same time, so that allows for the development of better prosthetics. With facial injuries, you get the kind of advent of cosmetic surgery out of that. So again, lots of cases at the same time. It really becomes a spur to that kind of investment and observation.
Well, then what is the impact on civilian medicine?
So it's the case that there's a lot of funding for certain types of medicine during wartime that advances the war effort and helps preserve manpower. For example, doctors discovered that wound shock is caused by acid in the blood, so that needed to be combated to save lives.
And another one that it's mentioned a lot, but of course it's really important. Penicillin, we talked
which you're
about.
allergic to, which I know now.
Yes, yes. But I can appreciate the benefits of penicillin. Now, the mass production of penicillin is often associated with wartime.
But whether these things would have been developed otherwise, obviously wartime sometimes creates a mass demand for certain products and certain innovations that might not have existed otherwise. But in a lot of these cases, there's certainly ambient research already being done. A lot of the work has already been done by the time that war gives it that extra push.
So clearly lots of examples of war being a catalyst to pushing innovation over a threshold because of demand, just pure quantity.
Correct.
And timing, I think, the rush.
Yeah.
But would a battlefield be its own test bed?
And I think there is absolutely something to the idea that a crisis creates needs, creates demands. And it's also maybe controversial to say, but in wartime, there's a lot more possibility for experimentation on soldiers, which would be unethical in peacetime because you can't necessarily treat civilian volunteers the way you would military personnel. So a lot of these kinds of innovations or the trials that are being done, you wouldn't necessarily get away with in peacetime and kind of the normal parameters of medical research and testing.
So coming back to the role of medical innovation in war overall, how does Elise reconcile the two disciplines of saving as many lives as possible, but for the enemy, you want to end as many of those lives as you can in war?
Yeah, it's really, really tricky.
Yeah, I think there's been a trend amongst historians to think about what's called the medical balance sheet of war, or is war good for medicine? I think there is a commonly held belief that it is, in part because war does create these circumstances that lead to increased demand, that leads to increased funding, that lead to certainly some innovations. But then you do really have to weigh that against all the costs. You have to consider that some of the gains are very circumstantial, very kind of limited to, again, the context of the war itself, the kinds of injuries that are sustained in war. Also to remember that a lot of the gains are quite short-lived.
It is true that disciplines like psychiatry got a huge boost after or during and then after the First World War.
I mean, we did an episode
exactly
about
on PTSD
yes.
and the mental impact on uniformed service people, right?
Yeah.
But look, then demand recedes. The funding starts to peter away. Veterans who are very well cared for during and maybe in the immediate aftermath of the war, their care is slowly eroded and neglected.
And then things like nutritional standards go down in wartime. So there are huge kinds of detrimental health consequences. And I guess we need to weigh those advances against some of the limited benefits.
Yes, and there's certainly no utilitarian balance between any alleged good that's coming out of war and, the impact on human health.
We have a sense that there's always money for military operations. Whenever we approve a budget across the state, there seems to always be lots of money for war, and there are lots of cuts to other things, including health, right? So we maybe don't prioritize health in a civilian setting the way we do health in conjunction with war. But we maybe need to think about the preservation of life outside of the context of war is just as important. I also think that if we weren't already ready for those crises, right, if we didn't already have vaccine programs in development, if we weren't already doing research on penicillin, that you wouldn't have been able to scale up that demand during wartime if the seeds of work weren't already there. So I sort of think our ability to meet these demands do require lots of investment outside of the context of war.
Well, it sounds like Elise was really interesting to talk to.
100%, and really put to bed the idea that war is a singular driver of innovation in medicine. It's not. What drives innovation in medicine, frankly, is the very human response of trying to save human lives when there is real pressure on, when there's really difficult things to be dealt with, irrespective of whether it's war or famine or plague or what have you.
Or whether it's medicine for your body or medicine for your mind.
Indeed.
What have you learned this week?
So, the nature, and you're going to like this because you're a language geek like me, the nature of English and the way that it uses words like add and enhance and words like improve and create means that when you start to try to improve something, you usually try to add things to a solution when the answer actually might be to take things away and make things more simple.
Oh, that's interesting.
But the nature of the English language is something that tends to make English speakers want to add things. And this is now showing up in machine learning driven algorithms being applied in large language models for chatbots. Chatbots trained on English language tend to make things more complicated when they're trying to improve things.
It's the Rube Goldberg rule of speaking.
That's it.
I love
That's
it.
exactly that. It's absolutely
Let's
amazing.
take the most complex route to the destination.
The paper is published in Cognitive Science in April. It's an international team from the University of Birmingham, Glasgow, Potsdam, and Northumbria University. So there you go.
As long as we're on AI, there's a news story on science.org about cesarean deliveries, which are going up in Rwanda, but doctors are using an app, a smartphone app, with AI that is helping them detect certain patients that might get post-surgery infections.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there.
So it
More
used to
joy
be
from AI.
Used to be there's an app for that. It's now there's an AI for that.
There's an AI for that.
Lord, where will it all end? I, for one, welcome our new AI overlords.
I know you do. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Discovery Matters. Our producer is Beth Armit Brewster, editing, mixing, and supervision by Ulrike Svensson and Tom Henley from Banda Productions. Music from Epidemic Sound. My name is still Dodie Axelson.
And my name is Conor McKechnie. Make sure you rate us on Spotify or whichever platform you use. We'll see you when we come back with another episode of Discovery Matters.